Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Tuesday edition of Point of View, and I'm just thrilled that you could be joining with us today, as we're going to be talking about a lot of different issues in the first hour. For example, is the president in charge? That was a question raised in a Twitter post by the senior senator from the state of Texas. And the amount of criticism that came down is pretty amazing in light of what I think many of us see. So we're going to talk about that for just a minute. We'll get into what is the real problem at the border and give you an update on that, because that is our second article we've posted. Then again, I want to listen to and hear from many of you in the state of Georgia, because this just goes from bad to worse. Now, actor Will Smith decided to pull his film out of Georgia, and instead they'll shoot it in Louisiana, which has, in some respects, more restrictive laws in terms of voting than the ones just passed by the legislature. And if that's not enough, we have about 100 different major corporations that have now decided that they're going to actually fight against election laws in a number of different states. So we're going to cover that in some detail. But also, I want to focus at least part of our time this hour, and maybe it'll be the next half hour, on the vaccine and the virus. First of all, there are some that are saying we need to close down the state of Michigan because, as I mentioned yesterday, that has become such a hot spot. I am not ignoring, nor will we ignore this hour, the fact that Johnson & Johnson, which has provided a vaccine because of the concerns about blood clots, that the CDC has now suggested, and actually acting on that suggestion, to actually pause the distribution of Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Not completely different from some of the concerns raised in Europe with the European Union with AstraZeneca. And as a program note, let me just mention that we had this scheduled for about a week, but now perhaps even more appropriate. Curtis Chang will be with us on Thursday. He's with a project called Christians and the Vaccine. And I think it would be a great opportunity for you if you wanted to ask him a question or more, or state some comments about the vaccine, about the pandemic, about the lockdowns, and a number of other things. He has attempted to, along with a number of other individuals, kind of provide resources to pastors and Christian leaders and others who are obviously getting questions from people in their congregation, people in their ministry, about how to think about this from a Christian point of view. You know, for example, how effective are these vaccines? Of course, in the past, we've done a program where we talked about, well, what about these mRNA vaccines, and what do we know about them, and how do they affect the body, and are there chips in them to track us down, which I think we answered that one pretty effectively. But there are now all sorts of other questions. And, of course, there have always been the questions about pro-life questions and a number of other issues that have been written about. So you might start saving up some of your questions for Thursday, but we will get into the fact that Johnson & Johnson now finds themselves not able to produce as many vaccines, but probably just as well, because now the CDC has called for a pause in that regard. And so we'll get into that in the next hour. And of course, there's the whole issue of whack-a-mole. The federal government has decided they're not going to send additional vaccines to Michigan, even though Governor Gretchen Whitmer asked for them. You can imagine if the federal government under Donald Trump did this, she would be in the news talking about how it's a complete bias and how incompetent the president is. Or maybe she's still going to say that about Joe Biden. I don't know. But and then that's one of them. And of course, Dr. Fauci saying, you know, even though we've had 100 million Americans that have received at least the first dose or more of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine, not to mention the ones that have had Johnson & Johnson, it's still probably required that we all wear masks, we can't eat inside, and a number of other things. And so we will get into all of that. And that's just the first hour. Now, I want to give you an advance notice that something we're going to do in the second hour is something I like to do from every once in a while, and that is kind of a teaching time. And this one has to do with the Federal Reserve. What is the Federal Reserve? What is the Federal Reserve doing? How is it that now we are printing so much money? How will that affect you and your family, the economy, your investments, maybe your children's or grandchildren's inheritance? I'm going to try to get into all that. Do not claim to be a financial analyst, but I also can give you the facts about the fact that 30% of all the dollars that exist on this planet, either in this country or in other countries, were produced in the last year. Just think about that. I mean, we have had a remarkable increase in the money supply. We've also had an incredible jump in the federal deficit like never before. And as much as we might say this was justifiable in light of the fact that we were dealing with a pandemic and then these subsequent lockdowns, it is going to affect your money. And so I wanted to try to tell you the truth about what I've been able to discern. And of course, as always, you can ask questions as well. And you can take it with a grain of salt. Just don't take it with a bag of salt, because most of the numbers and we're going to even show some charts on the screen. So those of you who have access to a computer can look at those and say, okay, I need to reevaluate the future, because we always assume the future will be like the present. Matter of fact, we even assume it'll be like the past. And I think any of us living in the 21st century figured out a long time ago that's not the case. And anybody that's lived through the last year recognizes that's certainly not the case. So we're going to try to educate you as best as we can with the available data. There are always hidden motivations. There are all sorts of things happening behind the scenes that none of us know about. But in light of what we do know, it talks about in 1 Chronicles 12:32 that there were the sons of Issachar that understood the times with knowledge of what Israel was to do. And I think we need to be like those individuals who understand our time with knowledge of what we should do. So nevertheless, that's a long introduction into what we're going to be doing today. First hour, second hour. And as we go to a break, let me just point out very simply, our first article here is, so now it's bad to ask if the president is really in charge. And this has to do with a tweet that was posted either by Senator John Cornyn or somebody in his staff, where it talked about the fact that the president is not doing cable news interviews. Very few tweets coming from him, and they're very limited, and they're not real imaginative. They're sort of conventional, almost boilerplate. Public comments are almost largely scripted, and he's opted, that is, the president has opted for very few sit-down interviews with mainstream outlets. And so that led to Senator John Cornyn invites the question, is he really in charge? And as you might imagine, you have some people saying that this is either inappropriate, offensive, or racist. I wasn't sure where you get the racist one, but again, this is where Aaron Blake reads into it that, well, what you're implying then is the Vice President, Kamala Harris, is actually the one in charge. No, not really. I don't know how many people believe that she's really in charge, but okay, if you want to believe that. And then that must be racist because she's a woman and the first black person to hold that job. No, it is because we all see what we see, and it's almost become forbidden to ask a fundamental question. And in case you wonder about this, I want to go into, after the break, all the different times in which people question whether George W. Bush was in charge or whether or not his vice president was charged. How many people wondered whether Donald Trump was in charge? This is not atypical, but what we see, I think, elicits this kind of response. So we'll come back and talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Would investments by the federal government and state governments help improve America's infrastructure? The answer is obviously yes. Is the current bill before Congress about much more than rebuilding America's infrastructure? Again, the answer is obviously yes. The president and his administration promoted it as a once-in-a-lifetime infrastructure bill. Given the fact that it will cost at least $2 trillion, you could certainly say that. I say at least because other politicians are asking for $4 trillion, and one member of Congress suggested $10 trillion. Apparently, some members of Congress do believe that money grows on trees and are ready to turn our dollars into monopoly money. Critics argue that only about 5% of the spending plan goes to roads and bridges. The White House argues that a quarter will actually fund basic infrastructure. But no matter which estimate you accept, that still leaves most of the spending bill allocated to something other than what most of us would consider to be infrastructure. The bill has $400 billion for expanding health care. There is $213 billion for affordable housing, research, training, and development programs, and $50 billion to the National Science Foundation, $50 billion to the Department of Commerce, and there is something called the PRO Act, which is intended to make it harder for workers to choose to stay out of unions. In case you wonder who will pay for this, I think you know the answer. The payment plan involves tax hikes that will actually impact you, your family, and the economy. It's likely that we might get spending without tax hikes, forcing the Fed to print even more money. This spending binge is unnecessary, but it will be justified by politicians who will falsely argue that the legislation will build up our crumbling infrastructure. This is not in the country's best interests. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation at any point, 1-800-351-1212. First article I've posted, I won't spend too much more time on it, but it comes from Dan McLaughlin. And the whole question, is it appropriate to ever ask whether or not the president is in charge? And one of the things he points out is it's not the job of the Washington Press Corps or the Washington Post to run interference against Congress questioning the president. One of the reasons why we have the 25th Amendment is for that. And if it doesn't look like he is kind of running the show or there are other people running it, it's important because we voted for him, or many of you voted for him, and now people that you don't know might be actually orchestrating that as well. And you can even go back to some of the things that were written in the Washington Post. This one by Paul Waldman, who talked about a year and a half into his presidency, one has to ask if we'd better off if we would just have Trump do some ribbon cutting, he says, hold some rallies and things of that nature, because the argument being made in this rather lengthy op-ed, I guess it was just an editorial there in the Washington Post, was the president, in this case, Donald Trump, is not in charge. I think we found out otherwise, but nevertheless, that is the case. And lest you think, well, that's just the Washington Post, this piece I wanted to commend to you in case you find yourself in a conversation with somebody saying, well, is it ever appropriate to ask whether or not the president is in charge? Well, the White House press corps had no problem asking that 4 years ago, 3 years ago, even 2 years ago. Let's go, for example, to 2017. I'll just pick a few of these. Bloomberg, Timothy O'Brien, who's running Trump's White House? Okay. Then even very near the end in the Atlantic, David Graham, is Trump actually still in control? Okay. And of course, as I pointed out just a minute ago, it wasn't just Donald Trump. Those of us a little bit older can remember that one of the most common attacks against George W. Bush and his 8 years in the White House was the claim that the vice president, Dick Cheney, and his assistant, or actually his unofficial almost chief of staff, Karl Rove, were really running the show. So I posted this one in case you find yourself involved in some kind of conversation. Maybe you post something on Twitter or Facebook raising the question. It's just a very good piece that reminds us that that is a question that has been asked for some time. And when the senator from the state of Texas, who has been in Congress for a very long time and has been in politics, both Texas politics and federal national politics, even longer, says, doesn't seem to me like this president is in charge of what is happening day to day in the White House. It's a reasonable question, and for him to be criticized as he was is why I thought I would post this as one of the articles. Well, let's move on. We've got a lot more. And one of the places where you do wonder who's in charge has to do with our southern border. I mean, after all, this was not necessarily something that Joe Biden said he was going to put himself in charge of dealing with. He, of course, has his Department of Homeland Security dealing with that. But also he said his vice president was going to be in charge. And the point that Mark Krikorian points out is there seems to be a real disagreement about the nature of the problem in our southern border, because obviously most of the commentary so far has been about the terrible conditions in which the migrants are being held. You think? Of course, the conditions are terrible, and he goes through and reminds us of how some of them are warehoused in Border Patrol facilities, some of them are in shelters. There are all sorts of problems. Some have had to sleep under a bridge. I mean, we are treating the migrants coming here the way, in some respects, even the homeless aren't treated. And so then he points out but this is where we get a disagreement. According to the Democrats, at least in Congress, the problem is that we just aren't processing these illegal aliens fast enough. Whereas I think most of us would say, no, that's not the problem. The problem is we have huge numbers of people that are illegally surging across the border, and there doesn't seem to be any attempt to stem the tide, if anything. Again, except the line out of the White House that this is just seasonal. Let's just look at some numbers, okay? In March, we've now finished March, apprehensions by the Border Patrol reached a 20-year high, with the number of unaccompanied children two times as high as you had in February, and those family units are triple what it was the month before. So again, this as an overall number was 20 years. You have to go back 20 full years to get anything that looks like what has just happened in the month of March. And if you look at the number of unaccompanied children, that's doubled. You look at the number of families, that has tripled. And so, as Byron York points out, under administration orders, they are no longer really trying to prevent people from entering the United States illegally. Rather, they're attempting to humanely house and feed thousands prior to releasing them into the country. And the border guards and guardians, he says, are overwhelmed and increasingly giving way to bureaucratic pressure to let most people in. And so in some respects, these numbers just remind us that we're not even getting an honest appraisal of what is happening down there. How many programs have you seen in the last week in the news that have even talked about the border? It's kind of like the press covered it, okay, move on, and they're on to all sorts of other issues. And there are other issues to talk about. I'm not ignoring that, but this is unprecedented. It is something that has reached peaks that we haven't seen in 20 years. And yet, again, if this were a Trump administration crisis, I got a feeling there would be people down at the border every day, and there would be live stand-up reports. But instead, that's not exactly what is taking place as well. Let's just, before we take a break, come back real quickly to one of the other issues that we talked about earlier in the week, and that is last week we talked about 60 Minutes and the fact that in some respects, even individuals that would not necessarily be considered friends of the Republican governor in Florida, Ron DeSantis, for example, the Democratic mayor of, was it Palm Beach County, and the Democratic head of the emergency management facility for Florida, were very, very critical of 60 Minutes. And of course, I had even said last week, well, we'll see whether or not there's any kind of apology that comes on Sunday. And so yesterday, I didn't really get into it, so let's come back to it, because after the incident, you thought, okay, would Sharon Alfonsi actually deal with this at all? And she did acknowledge, for example, that some viewers, including a retired newsman, applauded the story, but others condemned it, and then sort of made it sound like, well, because we had such controversy, we were doing a good job. And this What you see so often when some of these public figures are, if we're taking flack, then we must be over the target. Well, Charlie Cook says sometimes that is true. But sometimes, though, it means you're just being, and he comes up with a word I can't say on the air. At least my wife would not be happy, or my mother would be happy if I used the same word. But the point he's making is that sometimes you deserve the criticism, and just by saying you got some criticism and sloughing it off doesn't do any good at all. And so the way in which this was covered is kind of like, well, half of one, six of one, half dozen another. Some people thought it was good, and some people thought it was not so good. Some people condemned it. They did, to their credit, post some letters saying, I'm going to watch 60 Minutes just to see whether or not you post my letter, then I'm never watching it again. And, of course, you have to ask the question, why did CBS go down to Florida, spend 3 months searching for a scandal, and then end up coming up with something that, quite frankly, was quite easy to debunk? But nevertheless, as I've really argued last week, there is a real problem with the mainstream press, which, first of all, isn't mainstream anymore, and that just inability to say, you know what, we messed up. We should have played this part of the interview. We didn't place this interview. We should have talked to these individuals. There's more to the story, but instead, simply just kind of, that's just the way it is. We got some criticism, and because of who we are, we kind of expect that criticism, and that was the best you got. So some people said there was remorse, there was an apology. If that's an apology, that's something I'd like to develop in my family, because I think most people on the other side of that wouldn't feel like that was exactly an apology. It's more of like, well, if you were offended by that, well, I apologize that you were offended, but I don't think I did anything wrong. And that seems to be the way most people are taking the response from 60 Minutes. Once again, as we pointed out, if there was a pantheon of news programs, 60 Minutes used to be there, and even it has demonstrated that it has trouble dealing with the facts. When you play fast and loose with the facts, eventually people no longer trust you. Let's take a break. We got a lot more to cover. We'll be right back.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. And what started in Georgia seems to be going around the country. In just a minute, I'm going to talk about the fact that now there were 100 top executives that have actually met together on a Zoom call to plot against any kind of state, including, of course, Georgia, but Texas would be in that, and many others that actually want to begin to formalize various election integrity rules and regulations. And a lot of this seems to circle back to this whole issue that we have talked about for years here on Point of View, and that is whether or not to have a voter ID. And so I'd love to hear from some of you, especially maybe our African-American listeners, because the argument that seems to be made right now is the Georgia law, which says you could in the past with an absentee ballot sign it, but then the signatures have to match, and that leads to too much subjectivity. And as I pointed out, the last time there was an analysis of that, I think that was in the 2018 election, which is an off-year election, and they found that of the ballots that were rejected, 54% of them were rejected from African Americans. So in some respects, if you wanted to eliminate what obviously might have been a racial issue, that is the case. And so the simple requirement now is that if you want a ballot, you have to have your voter ID number or any other identifier. And so that means you've got a driver's license or even a government-issued ID, which is given to you free of charge. And if I look at the latest national survey, it found that 69% of African-American voters believe that voters should require a photo identification, such as a driver's license, before being allowed to vote. And so, first of all, that's already been required in the state of Georgia. All we're talking about is that now you would use the same kind of ID to get an absentee ballot, and it's a no-excuse absentee ballot in the first place. And so when you have, as we get now to our third article here today, that the actor Will Smith has said, you know what? We just cannot put up with what is happening there. It's Jim Crow Part 2, if you will. So here it has Will Smith's upcoming film, Emancipation, directed by Antonin Fuqua, will no longer be filmed in Georgia due to the state's new voter law, which they actually are arguing would actually disenfranchise black voters. And if you look at this, first of all, as Guy Benson has pointed out, Apple and Will Smith are moving their new film about slavery out of Georgia to protest the voting rights law. And it's going to be filmed instead in Louisiana, which requires voter ID, same thing, has fewer days of early voting, which I've talked about before, and does not allow no-excuse absentee voting. So in every particular factor that has been mentioned by, again, you might remember some of those being mentioned by President Joe Biden, who received how many? 4 Pinocchios from the Washington Post because of the misinformation he was spreading, but nevertheless pulling out now. And of course there have been some others that saying, just think of the number of African Americans that would have been working on that film, because after all, it's a film about slavery. So you are going to have probably a disproportionate number of actors and actresses and seconds and walk-ons and others that would have been black, and all they simply are left just like many of those that were hoping to actually work the All-Star game in Atlanta, simply because Will Smith pulled out. A lot of people are starting to call Coca-Cola or Delta or a variety of others that decided to come down on the state of Georgia, including the Major League Baseball. But now what you have put together, and this has just been reported, and we'll post this maybe in the future by Art Moore, is you have 100 of the nation's top corporate executives that held a Zoom meeting in which they wanted then to organize opposition to 47 different states, which, like Georgia, are at the moment considering various laws to firm up what we would call voter integrity. And so you had lawmakers in these 47 states. They've introduced about 361 different bills to address election integrity. Of those, at least 55 of them are moving through legislatures in 24 states. And of course, Georgia has been kind of the tip of the spear. Now, the proponents of the law for Georgia, according to this article, argue that it actually expands ballot access and other measures which are in the best interest of all individuals, black, white, brown, whoever it might be. And I would agree. As I pointed out yesterday, Gary Bauer and others have actually said, if you think about it, the laws in Georgia are compromising in a way that maybe really raise some questions, because now if all you have to do is show the number from your voter ID, there's less likelihood that necessarily you are filling out the ballot. And so in some respects, the potential for voter fraud, I think, increases with some of these. But if nothing else, it vastly expands access because it adds additional days to when you can vote. It provides no excuse absentee voting, which again, I think raised some very significant questions. And so the whole argument keeps being made that all of this has to do with the fact that, well, some individuals, maybe poor, African American, whatever, do not have a photo ID, when we recognize that if there's anything, this is what you almost need now in this culture to function. But nevertheless, if you want to know who some of these individuals are, you have the owner of the Atlanta Falcons, you have the son of Rupert Murdoch, you have the CEO of Walmart, you have the CEO of United Airlines, you have the CEO of American Airlines, you have the chairman of Levi Strauss, you have the CEO of LinkedIn, to mention just a few. And of course, they're joining with Delta, Coca-Cola, Major League Baseball, and the rest. And if nothing else, it's led to a lot of people being quite critical. Texas Governor Greg Abbott, for example, said that the Georgia law is no more restrictive than the election laws in the state of Delaware. And you might remember the current president, Joe Biden, comes from Delaware, and so that is the case. And we pointed out on the Friday weekend edition, if you haven't heard this, there is a state lawmaker in Georgia that finally had enough of this, and so he actually proposed legislation which has the long title, the President Joe Biden Jim Crow on Steroids Voter Act, and it has 5 features in which it would actually restrict Georgia's law because it would tie Georgia's election law to Delaware. Of course, people unfortunately didn't see the humor in that, but he's saying, okay, if indeed that is the case, then I guess we'll simply come back and pass laws that are identical to Delaware, since obviously Joe Biden has no problem with those. And if you were to do that, then you really would have restrictive laws. But anyway, let me open up the phones, because Candace Olin the other day was just pointing out the fact that she feels, if anything, telling individuals, she's African American, but telling African Americans that voter ID laws are racist is actually seemingly looking down your figure and looking down your nose at these individuals. She says, pretending we are too stupid to figure out how to get to the DMV is an insult and speaks volumes about what they truly think about us. So I'd love to get your thoughts about that, because if nothing else, once again, we are seeing what started now in Georgia has made its way now to the corporate headquarters of 100 different corporations. And at this point, I just would want to ask these corporate leaders, are you that ignorant of the basic facts? If you ran your company based upon the misinformation that is being spread about these voter laws, and if you ran your company believing that kind of misinformation, it's amazing you're still in business. It is embarrassing, given the fact that, as we pointed out, some of the things that the president said actually earned him 4 Pinocchios from the Washington Post. And it illustrates again that ideology and image is more important than facts. Reminds me of what happened in Indiana, where they were passing or at least trying to pass a Restoration Act on terms of religious liberty, and the particular act was no different than the one that had actually been proposed by Ted Kennedy in the Senate and by Chuck Schumer in the House. But now, years later, passing this idea of religious liberty, that, of course, was too controversial. And so in some respects, ideology seems to be more and more trumping just the basic facts about election law. And it's gone from Georgia now to 47 different states around the country. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. We'll take some phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. I think some of you want to talk about this idea of voter ID, but also now this attempt by pulling together 100 of the top executives in the country to begin to plot against election integrity laws, which have been introduced in 47 states. And so this is not just a Georgia issue anymore. It's going to become a national issue, and it is all based upon, to be nice, false information, misinformation. How about the word lies? And nevertheless, you would think that some of these very smart CEOs would look at this and go, wait a minute, I think we're overreacting. This actually expands voter access, doesn't narrow it down. And some of the states that we're talking about moving our films to or corporations to or whatever actually have more restrictive laws than the ones in the state of Georgia. But anyway, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351 800-351-1212. And I'll get to those in just a minute. But I also did want to mention one of our last articles here is to be in prayer for especially some of our listeners up there in Michigan right now. There has been a plea on the part of the governor, Gretchen Whitmer, called on the federal government to send more coronavirus vaccines to her state to deal with a surge of virus in recent weeks. But the Biden administration said, no, we're really not going to do that. One of the senior advisors to the Biden administration said that the coronavirus variants that we've seen in Michigan, well, those variants are also present in other states. So our ability to vaccinate people quickly in each of these states, rather than taking vaccines and shifting them to Michigan to play whack-a-mole, isn't the strategy that public health leaders and scientists have laid out. And so one of the arguments being made right now is the director of the Centers for Disease Control, Rochelle Walensky. Dr. Walensky has suggested that really what Michigan should do is close things down once again. So that has been in the news. And then, of course, the announcement today that the one-shot Johnson & Johnson vaccine, they've now recommended a pause in the use of it because of blood clots. This argument being made, they wanted to do this out of abundance. And as of at least yesterday, April 12th, more than 6.8 million doses of Johnson & Johnson vaccine have been administered in the United States. They have a number of cases of women between the ages of 18 and 48 with some of these symptoms and blood clots. And, of course, this is something we've talked about before because it also hit the issue of AstraZeneca in Europe. And if you want to get the final numbers, and let me take some phone calls then, United States basically has had 31.2 million confirmed coronavirus cases. That's probably undercounting because there are a lot of people probably that have it that don't know they did. 562,500 deaths. And the global totals are 136 million cases, 2.94 million deaths, and 237 million vaccine doses distributed, 189 million that have been administered. And of course, this is something that a lot of people are looking at in terms of the fact that hospitalizations in the state of Michigan have reached 3,953, almost 4,000 on Monday. And some are linking it to youth sports. Not that the youth necessarily were the ones passing it, but all the people that gathered together might be. But I think they're still grasping on what may or may not be the explanation. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to the state of Georgia. First of all, WAGP. And Larry, what would you add to our conversation today?
Yes, sir. I was listening to you earlier, and you were making some statements which I totally agree about. Any CEO that would run a company the way that they're doing about this voter, the laws and restrictions they're calling, but they're not restrictions. They're just more or less just trying to verify. But it would seem to me as though I can't believe that they're that stupid. I'll just use the word stupid because that's what it is. But it seems as though they're trying to jump on a bandwagon in order to sell their product. And the same with Will Smith. He's getting some a little bit of news coverage and promoting his film, and he's going to a place that has more voter restrictions and more problems than Georgia does. So these become what we call hypocrites that don't really care about people at all. They care about their own self and promoting their own agenda. And we get that also that when they do this, then they cause things that might be good to be restricted and things that probably are bad to not be restricted.
Well, again, your point about hypocrisy is certainly the case. And again, if they just looked at the facts, that is the case. Now, I'll be the first to admit that, first of all, there are some that are doing this because they're feeling the pressure from the woke mob. You know what? They need to feel the pressure from us on the other side, I think, sometimes. So there are some that are doing it because they just want to go which way they think is going to help their company. There's some that are true believers and believe believe that there is a resident amount of racism, and any kind of law that would in any way require a person to have an ID is restrictive and racist. But there are also a good number, and in this article I'm reading from, you also have a few CEOs that are saying, we don't really think this is going to be a winning situation. Anybody thinks this is going to be win-win, yeah, you might get a few people that say, okay, maybe it's something that causes me to want to go to an Atlanta Falcons game or get on an American Airlines flight or a Delta flight. I think what's going to happen is a lot of people are going to say, look, we didn't want our corporations to get involved in politics. And even if you get involved in politics, at least get the facts right. And this, I think, is hopefully going to end up being a really significant embarrassment to many of these CEOs. But the only way it ends up being an embarrassment is if we get enough people honest in the media to point out the hypocrisy and point out the contradictions of some of the things that they're asking for, because in many cases they're moving the All-Star game to a place that has more restrictive voter rights, and now Will Smith is moving his movie to a state that has more restrictive voter rights, and so that is the case. Let's get one more phone call here, and I'll stay in the state of Georgia here. Patricia, I think you've been a poll worker?
Yes, I have. Thanks for taking my call, Kerby. Yes, this 2020 was my 14th year as a poll worker, and there was a lot of issues that came up. There was a lot of mail out from various places, and our voters were coming to the polls and saying that they got a notification that they had not voted when they had early voted. And there was a lot of confusion in 2020. So therefore, this bill will really take care of some of the issues that came up in 2020. Now, as far as this ID and restricting voters, that is totally false. If people will read the bill, and here's the problem, most people will not read the bill.
That's
they
right.
haven't read the bill.
Mm-hmm.
So they actually, depending on somebody else, for instance, MSNBC and all these other places, to tell them about the bill, when in fact they haven't read the bill. And if someone asks me about it, I always ask you, have you read the bill?
Good
and they say, no. I said, well, you can't carry on a conversation with me.
I'm going to have to go to a break, but I think you got your point across here. And I maybe could read the bill just so maybe I could educate any CEOs that happen to be listening in. But the bottom line is that if you don't have a government-issued ID, and I think they identified maybe 1,000, 2,000 people in the state of Georgia that maybe don't, they can still get a free government-issued ID. And, of course, they can use a variety of other things, as I know you were going to get into, in terms of their bills and all sorts of other things. But the problem is it's not based upon facts. It's based upon ideology. And we'll see whether or not the mainstream media, whether it's really mainstream, even tells the truth. But we'll tell it right here on Point of View. And we'll come back and we'll have a teaching time about the Federal Reserve. All that coming up right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to spend some time doing a teaching time, and I'm going to do my best to try to educate you quickly about things like the Federal Reserve, the fact that we seem to be moving into a new era in which we are printing so much money that it's going to affect your future. And so I am not claiming to be a financial expert, but I am claiming at least to be able to look at some of the facts and figures and numbers and recognize that maybe, if nothing else, as a public service to you and to your family, this is of concern. And sometimes we assume that the future will be pretty much like the past, or even like the present. And I think anybody that has lived to now the 21st century knows that that is not the case. Anybody who's lived through this last year knows certainly that is not the case. And there are going to be some impacts that you need to evaluate for you and your family. And so whether you find yourself would pass on to your children or to your grandchildren, I'm hoping that this will be helpful to you. And it's been a while since we've actually talked about things like the Federal Reserve or budget deficits or a number of other things. We're going to get into all of that in this hour. And if you find yourself having some questions, hold off for a little bit, but we'll open up the phones and give you a chance to join the discussion. And last hour, even as I was kind of introducing that, I said, if you want to use some biblical principles, one of those you find in the Old Testament in 1 Chronicles 12, verse 32. It talks about the sons of Issachar were men who understood the times with knowledge of what Israel is to do. And I think we are to, as Christians in this 21st century, understand the times we are in with knowledge of what we should do, and we really need to begin to plan for the future. And certainly Isaiah 32:8 says, the noble man devises noble plans, and by noble plans he stands. We certainly should have plans, but we also need to be sensitive to God's directing in our life, because in Proverbs 16, verse 9, also talks about the fact that the mind of man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. So I recognize that you're going to have to actually spend time in prayer and maybe even doing your own research to find some things. But I do want to maybe talk for just a few minutes, first of all, about the Federal Reserve. And I'm going to focus in this first segment maybe about on kind of the history. And then for those of you that have access to a computer, we're going to have Steve post 4 different slides as we go along. Not the first one won't come up until the second segment, so you got some time to find a computer, pop it up on your phone, because sometimes one graph can help you see something much easier than for me to try to describe it. But for those of you who don't have a computer, I'll do my best to describe it. And when you talk about the Federal Reserve, I used to have a guest on the program that used to say that the chairman or the head of the Federal Reserve, since we had Janet Yellen in the past, is the most important man in America. And I bet if I went out right now and asked people with a microphone in my hand who's the chairman of the Fed, they probably couldn't tell you. But he is certainly important, and we'll get into some of his comments. And, of course, the prior one, of course, is now the Secretary of Treasury, so it's important to keep in mind. But let's, if we can, talk about what is the Federal Reserve. We always have a joke that it's not necessarily a federal agency, and it has doubtful reserves. But nevertheless, it's called the Federal Reserve. And you really need to go back to 1913. That's really where the Federal Reserve Act was actually created. What you had at the time were a group of bankers, which were actually at that time called monopoly men, and they traveled on a sealed train down to Jekyll Island in Georgia. They even used code names so that they could actually put together the forming of a central bank. Now, it's important to point out they certainly weren't successful at first. Actually, Woodrow Wilson tried to get that implemented years before, but eventually they were able to get a bill passed during Christmas season, and then President Woodrow Wilson signed it, and that started what was the beginning of the Federal Reserve System, and since then, of course, has provided a lot more power to them as well. It, in some respects, could be seen as given an unofficial power to print money. Now, they don't, first of all, actually print money. First of all, the Treasury Department does that. And second of all, it's not always necessarily printed. Sometimes it's just moving ones and zeros all around. But nevertheless, you had individuals that even began to see how powerful it could be. I've got this one quote from something I've written about here. In 1933, the Treasury Secretary at that time, William Wooden, said that the Reserve Act lets us print all we need, and it won't frighten money. It'll look like stage money. It'll be money that looks like money. Well, they were talking about that during the Great Depression in the 1930s. As we update this in a few minutes, you'll see what has happened since then. But, of course, you've had people that have questioned whether or not we should have a Federal Reserve in the first place. Ron Paul, of course, his son Rand Paul are a couple of obvious critics that you would be well aware of. But, you know, we did have a central bank in the founding of this country. It lasted for a while, but then eventually was killed by President Andrew Jackson. Matter of fact, he closed what was called the Second Bank of the United States. He killed the bank. And so in some respects, the justification for the Federal Reserve Act in 1913 was to, if anything, prevent bank failure, to maintain price stability and things of that nature. But nevertheless, that was kind of what was implemented in place. That brings me to, before I talk a little bit more about what the Federal Reserve does now, to the whole issue of money itself, because we used to have money that was as good as gold. But after World War II, actually as World War II was winding down, in 1944, there were delegates from a number of the Allied nations that met in Bretton Woods. And that's oftentimes referred to as the Bretton Woods Conference. That's where they produced everything from the International Monetary Fund, they produced the World Bank, and much more. But one of the things they did was they actually maintained a monetary policy that had an exchange rate of the currency which was fixed in terms of gold. And so the currencies of the world could float against the dollar. The dollar ultimately, and still in a sense, is the reserve currency, and it was fixed to the price of gold. Well, at that time, it was $42.22. Okay, fast forward to the 1960s. Now you got a problem. The United States was involved in Vietnam War, and President Lyndon Johnson also wanted to pass his Great Society program. Well, government was spending too much both on guns and butter, and eventually it was becoming more and more unlikely that the government could actually raise the taxes. Borrowing wasn't really an option, so they began to print more money. Well, that got us into problem real quickly because you have more dollars circulating around there, and yet it's all supposed to be tied to the price of gold, which at that time was $42.44. And you can begin to see that that wasn't going to work, since you could actually turn in dollar and get gold for $65 an ounce. And so at this point, that's when you closed the gold window. That was done by President Richard Nixon. And as a result, no longer have our dollars been tied to something like a fixed asset, like gold or anything else. And so we are in the world now of fiat currency. Well, I need to take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about how that has expanded dramatically, especially within the last year. We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Would investments by the federal government and state governments help improve America's infrastructure? The answer is obviously yes. Is the current bill before Congress about much more than rebuilding America's infrastructure? Again, the answer is obviously yes. The president and his administration promoted it as a once-in-a-lifetime infrastructure bill. Given the fact that it will cost at least $2 trillion, you could certainly say that. I say at least because other politicians are asking for $4 trillion, and one member of Congress suggested $10 trillion. Apparently, some members of Congress do believe that money grows on trees and are ready to turn our dollars into monopoly money. Critics argue that only about 5% of the spending plan goes to roads and bridges. The White House argues that a quarter will actually fund basic infrastructure. But no matter which estimate you accept, that still leaves most of the spending bill allocated to something other than what most of us would consider to be infrastructure. The bill has $400 billion for expanding health care. There is $213 billion for affordable housing, research, training, and development programs, and $50 billion to the National Science Foundation, $50 billion to the Department of Commerce, and there is something called the PRO Act, which is intended to make it harder for workers to choose to stay out of unions. In case you wonder who will pay for this, I think you know the answer. The payment plan involves tax hikes that will actually impact you, your family, and the economy. It's likely that we might get spending without tax hikes, forcing the Fed to print even more money. This spending binge is unnecessary, but it will be justified by politicians who will falsely argue that the legislation will build up our crumbling infrastructure. This is not in the country's best interests. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Hey, once again, we'll get back to the Federal Reserve in just a minute, but since I was talking about the dollar and the money supply, I thought I would focus on that because when Richard Nixon decided to close the gold window, if you will, he essentially repudiated the Bretton Woods Agreement that had actually been implemented in 1944. And so at that point, no longer was our dollar bill tied to anything tangible. Yes, we have gold in Fort Knox and a number of other places, but now it makes it much easier to print money. And so I thought I'd have Steve put up a diagram, which we'll look at a little bit later, but if you go to your computer right now, you'll see this particular diagram that shows the rise and basically the fall of the dollar. The purchasing power of the U.S. dollar has dropped since 1913 and has dropped even significantly since the Bretton Woods Agreement. You don't have to necessarily know too much about the economy to figure that out. You notice that prices are going up, and the reason prices are going up is because the value of dollar is dropping. Very popular. Then the government can borrow money, but you can only borrow so much from the private sector before some people say, look, I don't want to lend you anymore, which we're going to get to again in just a minute in terms of treasuries. So the other is you can print more money, and you can begin to understand that once you begin to print more money, you have sometimes inflation, but even if you don't have inflation, you have at least the dollar devaluing. Sometimes you get inflation, sometimes you get deflation. I'm going to get into all the technical issues here, but there are certainly an attempt, if anything, to try to mask inflation, because a lot of people tend to think that the actual inflation rate is the same as the consumer price index. I've written about this in commentaries in the past, and that is really where the government takes a basket of goods and, as a result, then tries to determine whether there's been inflation. But one of the things I began to notice is that the government figures vastly understate the real inflation rate. For example, they exclude food and fuel. Well, if you think about your home, what do you buy? Food and fuel, right? And so those are actually kept off of the rate of core inflation. The argument was as food and fuel are too unstable to be included in the inflation rate, but I think this is done so that they don't have to, because if you have a consumer price index, you're supposed to actually increase that for those of you receiving Social Security or other government benefits. Also, even when sometimes the price goes up, the government sometimes will substitute less expensive products. For example, the price of steak goes up. Maybe they'll put in hamburger instead of steak. And so as a result, they then average the various commodities, and they use some other kinds of tricks so that in some respects, inflation's been taking place. Your value of your dollar is being devalued, and you really don't even necessarily notice it. John Maynard Keynes, who is probably the best known as a British economist for producing what today a lot of people call modern monetary theory, said by the continuing process of inflation, governments can confiscate secretly and unobserved an important part of the wealth of their citizens. He says there's no subtler, no surer means of overturning the existing basis of society than to botch the currency. The process engages in all the hidden forces of economic law that come down on the side of destruction, and does so in a manner that not one man in a million is able to diagnose. Well, if you'll permit me, I'm going to at least try to diagnose some of that, but let's, if we can, talk about this idea of printing money and where does that all come from? And it brings us down to the whole issue of the Federal Reserve. What is the Federal Reserve today? Well, it's basically a central bank, and it conducts what we call monetary policy, and it's dealing with things like inflation, and it has members that are appointed to Congress, but because they're appointed, they're supposed to be sort of free from politics.